All right, so to start. Yeah, thanks everyone for showing up and the interest in this talk, and for the fruitful conversation that we've had so far inside these rooms and over dinner and so forth. Maybe I'll start with a little bit of expectation management. So I'm not sure. The program says that this talk is on Simmel and Polanyi and Simmel. At some point, I must have had the idea that that there's this article by the Hungarian sociologist Karl Polanyi, or Austro-Hungarian sociologist Karl Polanyi. It's called Aristotle Discovers the Economy, and it seemed to me that he makes this argument that sort of the idea of the monetary economy changes something fundamentally how we think about production itself and the social relations that go along with it. And I thought, wow, this is very similar to an idea that Simmel has. I'm not so sure about this anymore, so I'm shifting my focus to a specific argument that's made in Simmel's philosophy of money. So it's not going to be on Polanyi. And then the second preamble, I'm not a real Simmel expert, so I'm primarily interested in money and secondarily in Simmel. So, and with many of the talks that I've seen, so the presentation were sort of surrounded by encyclopedic knowledge about, the theoretical surroundings of the authors. We have a real Simmel expert here, so I'll pass those questions on. I'm really focused on this one argument that you can find in Simmel's philosophy of money that I felt was sort of most closely related to the I think Joe's initial problem with how does money change the way we do philosophy or the way we think. And I think there's an argument that applies to this topic that's made in Simmel's philosophy of money, and I'll take something like maybe 45 minutes to present it and hopefully get your thoughts on this. Whether this seems like an argument to got it. Okay. So the position of money in Simmel's philosophy is a very central position. It's not just any common philosophical topic. It's not like he goes through fashion and then he goes through art, what's interesting about Rembrandt, and then he goes through money and tells us something about money. In the beginning of the philosophy of money, he says that his aim is to derive from the surface level of economic affairs a sounding line. In German, he used the word Richtschnur. The most sense I can make of it is, the sounding that you would use to sort of gather the depth of an ocean, because this seems to be closely related to the surface level. I think often it's translated as like a guiding line, but I think he's really trying to get into the depth, and the depth of what the ultimate values and things of importance in all that is human. So money or understanding money has a central benefit. It would enable us to understand something very central about the human condition. And so then the whole work is set up in two parts. He says, none of this is economic. No line. I think what he says is no line in this book is meant as an economic proposition. But he wants to establish what we have to understand that's sort of pre-economic, so the very conceptual roots of what money is, and then everything that's post-economic in a sense. So everything that the basic institution of money will do to social organization and our cultural self-understanding. And money has a huge impact. And so what's interesting, I think to fathom out about this is whether money is just sort of an example to show us like a general tendency in modernity, or whether money is the force that actually drives this process that Simmel observes in modernity. And it was a process that he seemed to have been unnerved by. Simmel grew up next to Friedrichstraße in Berlin. And in the late 19th century, this must have been a very, very busy place. Right in the center of it. The railroads being built, the city developing at an enormous pace, and sort of he must sort of felt, what the pace of this city means for his self-understanding as a person. All right, so the argument that I'm interested in is developed in a couple of works by Simmel, and I think that Simmel argues that money initiates and drives. Well, about the initiate, we can talk about that later, whether that's actually plausible to assume. Drives a fundamental shift that defines modern culture. And you can find this philosophical analysis, of course, in the philosophy of money, and a couple of talks that were given before the philosophy of money, and journal articles. And that was first published in 1900. And then two other central contributions: the metropolis and mental life, and then the concept and tragedy of culture, where it seems like the process that we're observing in money is a tragic process that's going to define modern culture. So if I'm not mistaken, and it's sort of hard to crystallize the different propositions that make up this argument. The philosophy of money is a very long book, not greatly organized, if I may say so. Very little reference, but it's full of sort of hints and reflections that all contribute, I think, to a central claim that he makes. And I sort of went through the book a couple of times to figure out, okay, what are the topics that reappear that could form this argument that Simmel make in a more condensed form in those other two papers as well. I think it has four main claims. Maybe they could be subdivided, but I think in this sense it works as it is stated here. The first one is something about how personality and culture are actually established, and he develops the idea that the development of our own personality and our social context in culture that occurs through a process of reflection in external objects. So we don't do this out of nothing, but we sort of look at things and find something about ourselves in these things. So you must be thinking not just of literature, of course, but also of architecture surrounding him, or artifacts that are made where we're wondering, to what purpose have men designed these artifacts? What technologies have we used? What desires do they fulfill? And so the Simmel thinks that it's crucial to sort of engage with these objects to figure something out about the culture that a subject lives in and develops in. Now, of course, money could be argued to be one of those external objects, but it's a very peculiar object that also has an impact on all the other reifications. And he says that money is constituted as a reified abstraction. We'll say a little bit more about what that means, of near relational economic validity. There's going to be more on what this obscure claim means. And this goes along with the peculiar qualitative emptiness of money. So, a dollar or a euro or a pound doesn't tell us anything qualitatively about what it is. Maybe the banknotes do. You can, on money records, of course, you can find a lot of reflection of, what culture that money is in. If you look at banknotes from Micronesia, they might have cowrie shells on it and a boat. If you look at banknotes from the Bank of England, they have the Queen on it. So, banknotes themselves, may have sort of this reflective quality, but money itself is defined by its qualitative emptiness. And this is interesting for Simmel because he thinks that this qualitative emptiness affects the objects that are valued in monetary terms. Probably more precisely, I would say, the argument would require to say the objects that are not just valued in monetary terms, but that are exchanged competitively. So whose allocation and distribution and production, the organization of all these processes, is left to the market. And so this would mean for Simmel that if those objects become drained of their materially rich cultural meaning, then and we need this sort of engagement with these objects, then so we're missing something, sort of a mirror that we would need, metaphorically speaking, for our personal and social self-development. And this will be impaired by monetization, and this changes the quality of social life altogether. And so then you can, of course, find all the processes that contemporaries of Simmel, like Ferdinand Tönnies, describe in the processes of, you know, contractualization, society instead of community, individualization, anonymization, and so forth. So let's look at these steps with a little more care and with a little more detail. Okay, so the constitution of culture and personality. So Simmel understands the constitution of subjectivity and personality as a process of self-recognition through objectification. That is, you know, we make something an object and we find something that tells us something about ourselves in that object. And in that, he draws, you know, on a broad tradition in German idealism. You know, and you have this figure again and again. Hegel's concept of action and his justification of property works through this. You know, what we do when we act is we objectify our will in external objects. And you know, some of those objects must be our property, so that we can actually objectify our will in a proper sense, so that we can eat them and, you know, put on our clothes, and nobody sort of messes with our will. Then Feuerbach thinks that God essentially is an objectification of the qualities that make us human. So rationality, love, and so forth. And Feuerbach actually thinks that what humans do is they actually, in order to figure out what it is that makes us all humans, we sort of make up this entity and see those qualities that are actually about us in this entity. And then Marx and Hess, both influenced by Feuerbach and Hegel, of course, have very similar ideas about this as well. The early Marx from the Paris manuscripts has an idea of objectification that can go terribly wrong under the capitalist labor, because it's alienated or estranged, in which ideally we would, through the production of objects that are of use to other human beings with whom we cooperate, we see that our species being is realized. So we need to produce objects, you know, like making a soup bar or producing a tool for another human being, to see that we actually fulfill our purpose as, you know, as Aristotelian sense, as social beings that we are. So there's a specific form of cooperation that requires a specific form of labor, that requires a specific form of objectification of our cooperation in external objects. And Simmel seems to have a very similar idea, namely that, you know, in order to, you know, it isn't exactly the same as Marx's idea. So Simmel doesn't care so much about the form in which we cooperate, but it's more about our cultural self-understanding. So the values that we have, the laws that we abide by, the cultural manners that we have, that are, you know, that will become manifest in external objects. You know, the cutlery that we use, the blankets that we put on the table, the paintings that are on the wall, the opera building, and so forth. So a very, you know, compared to Marx, who focuses exclusively on the process of production and economic cooperation, it's much more embedded in sort of all the aspects of cultural and social life that you would perceive in the community of a city, for example. So subjects understand themselves and their social environment through the perception of concrete objects, and he calls them Vergegenständlichungen des Geistes. So objectifications or reifications, so they're made Sachen or Gegenstände, objects in this almost literal sense, that they're physical objects. And you know, we could call them reification of the mind, but the point is not to say that there's some sort of external being that's reified in these objects, but that there's a specific form of meaning that's entailed in these objects. So we produce them for a specific purpose, following specific rules, and you can see that in different types of objects that are produced in a specific manner in society. Okay, so that's what we need in order to understand ourselves in society. Okay, so then now money and the market comes in. And so the first thing to note is how Simmel understands value, and then how Simmel understands the function of money in the constitution of monetary value. Simmel conceives of actually of all value, but of economic value in particular as relational in two regards. First, an object is never valuable, or the circumstance that an object is valuable isn't only expressed in a relation between me and an object. So it's valuable to me because I can drink it and hydrate, but it has to be, I can only value it by putting it in relation to other objects. So the value of an object is relational insofar as it can only be determined conceptually by what has to be sacrificed or given for it, what can be exchanged for it, or maybe you could also say, by the opportunity costs that I have when I use it in more modern economic terms. But it's always about sort of putting objects in relation to other objects. The objects don't have value in themselves. It's not an object-subject relation, but it's an object-object relations of the subject who compares these objects to another. And then, of course, that's not enough. Value in the market is furthermore determined by the relationality of the different valuations of subjects in societies. So market value results from the interactions of these competing valuations, and this changes value to that's probably another typo, to a suprapersonal relationship between objects. So what initially appears to be a relation between me and the object, when I look at it in the market, it seems like a relation between all the commodities that are exchanged for one another. And so value appears to be a relation between the objects. But that, of course, results from the subjective valuations of individuals who consider what they have to sacrifice in order to get or obtain another object. Okay. So now, all measurement is relational in this sense, and now money comes in. Now, one story to tell would be that money is just one more object that we sacrifice in order to get something else. But Simmel says that it's not an ordinary object that participates in this relation of valued objects, but he says it's somehow external to this relation, and sometimes he says it's even a manifestation of this relation between objects itself. So in his words, he says money is the separate realization, in German would be a Sonderverwirklichung, so separate realization of what is common to objects as economic objects, or in other terms, it's the embodied function of being exchanged. The pure relation of objects turned into a substance. So we have all these objects that are exchanged for one another, and Simmel says money is not simply one more object that we put into the equation, but money is sort of a condensed version of this equation. And I always ask myself, why does he sort of make this weird presumption that money can't really be part of this equation? Because obviously it's part of the exchanges that take place. And if you look at Marx's conception of money, it's clear that in the beginning, money is just a commodity that's, or in the beginning of the analysis, money is analyzed as something as a commodity. It's a universal equivalent, and there's a lot more to be said about this. But it's it seems to be like that is part of the equation. And I think Simmel wants to draw money out of the equation to show that money doesn't need to partake in all the qualities of the objects that are exchanged. So he wants to have abstract value in the sense that money has only the quality that makes objects valuable, but not the qualities that make objects valuable objects in particular. So money has the value that a pumpkin has, or the value that a chair has, but without the nutritional value of the pumpkin, or the convenience value of a chair. So money is the extraction of one aspect of everything that makes commodities valuable. And I think that's why he always says it's not, it's not part of the equation, but it's kind of external to the equation. He goes on to make a long argument because the objection that he gets is, well, how can it measure value if it doesn't have the quality value? If it doesn't have the same quality as the others, how can it measure the quality? It seems that, and then you think about scales and lengths. The argument that is made is it seems that if we want to have a measure for quality, then the measure must have the quality itself. So we measure weight by using a weight, or we measure length by using a length. That's why we have like a kilogram in Paris or a meter in Paris, and whatever you have here. But an object that has this particular quality. And Simmel says, and that's similar to an argument that I think we've discussed yesterday as well. We can just think about the way money measures value in terms of relationality again. So if we look at all the objects that are valued on the one side and all the money on the other side, he says there can just be two relations, and it's just a proportionality. So money is, the proportion of money to the given amount of money is the same as that you have to pay for one specific commodity is the same as the proportion of this one commodity to the whole realm of commodities that you find. And that, of course, comes with a lot of problems because it doesn't factor in, everything that you would have in equations that tell you about, the velocity of money and the exchanges that are taking place and so forth. But I think this can all be figured out and still leave his main claim in place that money doesn't have to have any of the particular qualities that make objects valuable. And Simmel needs this claim to illustrate why money is empty in the sense that will make money problematic for modern culture. And then one more thing on money, because I think this is kind of fascinating. Simmel's take on money is pretty in line with heterodox theory that usually when you read you read books on modern monetary theory and all this, and they say, well, look at Mitchell-Innes or Georg Friedrich Knapp. But the philosophy of money, that's 1900. Knapp's Wesen des Geldes is 1905. Although Simmel probably conversed with Knapp. I think Knapp helped Simmel to get his job in Strasbourg, so they were friends and they conversed. And Mitchell-Innes is 1913, 1914. So this doesn't tell me that sort of Simmel is this genius who had it all figured out. I think it just makes clear that this doesn't just come up 1905, but this is something that's widely discussed in the literature. Maybe you just go back to Henry Dunning MacLeod, who in the 1870s and 80s wrote a couple of treatises on banking and credit, and he developed all these sort of institutional tools that you need to figure out a credit theory of money. I think this was sort of much more widely sort of distributed among academics, and it seems to me that Simmel just has studied this kind of literature without having the legal background that authors like MacLeod had, but sort of took up on this idea and developed it here. So he says, and pretty much in line with Chartist monetary theory, money is only a claim upon society. And here in the next sentence, you have sort of IOU talk all the way down, or a promissory note. Money appears, so to speak, as a bill of exchange from which the name of the drawee is lacking, or alternatively, which is guaranteed rather than accepted. So, Simmel goes on to say that, so there's two things that could be said about this. One is, well, if money is a bill of exchange, which is clearly actually credit, then this doesn't make sense in the way we understand what a monetary payment is, because it seems that money isn't credit, but money ends relations of credit and debt. So what happens to the credit if we pay with it? And Simmel actually has an answer to this claim. Simmel says that you're mistaken if you think this. What happens when you pay a debt with money, with credit, is that society as a whole takes on the debt that you had towards your creditor, and now society as a whole owes something to the creditor, and that's what the creditor does when she uses her money again. But then they say, well, but surely not gold, but you said that seems to be clearly a form of commodity money. And Simmel is, again, he's fully in line with Knapp, which Knapp would have, or did subscribe to in Das Wesen des Geldes as well, that even in a society that that's based on a gold standard, even gold coins can be seen as tokens. They have to be made out of gold. That can be legally determined. But nevertheless, they're tokens that have the function of establishing records of credit and debt. So it's a social relation, and it's a particular social relation because it expresses, it's a substantiation, whatever that means, of the price relations that we see between commodities themselves. Now, the emptiness can be seen in the difference between money and ordinary objects, is that ordinary objects are valuable because of particular desired qualities. Again, of course, Simmel would add that we have to compare them to the other objects that we cannot have anymore if we take this object, but nevertheless, we want that object because of a particular quality that it has. And he says, money has no desirable quality of its own. As it is, he says, it's the absolute means, so it's just a means to get something else, or pure potentiality. So it's something where we can't see the value in what it is itself, but only in what we can do with it. And that's part of, I think, what he says is the misery of living in modern life, is that we all strive for money, and we all get this potentiality without actually knowing what we want to use this money for. So we strive for something that is a pure means. Also, a critique that's not new in the philosophy of money. If you've read Aristotle, we're acquiring something that we presume we're acquiring as an end, whether it is actually just a means to acquire something else. Now, you can say, well, that's fine, money is empty, but that doesn't make every object that I buy with money empty. And that's a claim that if Simmel wants to make this sweeping diagnosis of what modern culture is, and that's a claim that Simmel has to establish as well. And he says that due to its own qualitative emptiness, money becomes a terrible destroyer of form by making every object commensurable with everything that can be acquired in exchange for money. So the one part of the argument that he seems to have is that we sort of debase objects by making them commensurable with something else. So if we can express the value of a Stradivari violin in however many water bottles this is, sort of we're reducing the Stradivari violin to something that or to something less than it actually is. We're missing a quality in it, and we're missing this quality by saying that it could be just had for a specific amount of water bottles, or for even something worse, maybe something that doesn't have any intrinsic quality of its own, namely money. And then he goes on to say that this problematic form of valuation of the modern monetary economy finds its pure expression in what in Berlin must have been a thing around that time, the 50 Pfennig Bazaar, which would be probably a dollar store or a 99-cent store here. He said the problem about this is that objects aren't valued for what the accomplishments or the use that they have. So what technology goes into making this object? What's the origin of the design? What purpose does it fulfill in our society? But they're primarily valued for their price. The most important thing that you want to know when you go into one of those stores is that everything costs $1, which it isn't true, right? I mean, whenever I walk in there, nothing costs $1. Especially if you include sales tax. So, and of course, this doesn't mean that we don't see any quality of these objects. Of course, if you want a light bulb, you go into the store and you grab a light bulb. You don't just grab anything that costs 99 cents or $1. But he says, the primary quality that you observe is the price, and the function of the object and probably the circumstances that decided why the object has this price is secondary. Whereas in earlier, or in the more rudimentary pre-monetary form of valuation, you would have to think about, what do I have to sacrifice in order to get this? What benefit does it do me? What do others sacrifice to produce this? You would have to think about the material conditions of production. How did it come that this object costs this? Sometimes we actually do this. Sometimes we walk into a store and we ask ourselves, how can it be that a pound of chicken cost, I don't even know, $1 or something like that. Sometimes it's incredibly cheap, and you wonder, how can this be? What are the productive relations that go into this process? And Simmel says that monetary valuation sort of resolves us from thinking about this. We don't have to think about the qualities of the objects themselves anymore in order to evaluate whether the price is right or isn't right. We just accept the price as something that tells us whether we can have the object or whether we can't. I'm not sure if the argument is convincing, but I think that's the argument that he makes. Now, this may be a little too cartoonish for a tenured audience, but nevertheless. So the basic idea is there are cultural accomplishments. There's laws, institutions. We have opera. We have hors d'oeuvre. We have poems. We have Mercedes-Benz and so forth. And so the original way that Simmel, and I think also Marx, thought about this with different perspectives, of course, was that we produce objects, and they don't have to be material objects, but in many cases they will be material objects. And by receiving these objects, we look at those Lego blocks, and these Lego blocks tell us something about the culture that we live in. And by this, these Lego blocks tell us something about the culture that the person who acquires them lives in. It helps them sort of develop a position in the world. Now, where money comes in, the first thing that happens, of course, for Marx, it's interesting that it's a capitalist that decides about what is produced, and then the workers produce something, and they produce something very complex, and there's a vast amount of division of labor, so that we can't even fathom all the steps and bits that went into the production of something. And then we buy this object and we perceive it. And Simmel has some issues with the vast division of labor that we see in modern society, but I don't think that Simmel thinks that the division of labor is itself the main problem of objectification. I think that Simmel actually thinks that it is the monetary valuation. So it's a conceptual problem about what it means to evaluate objects in monetary terms that sort of cuts through this process of self-reflection that would, in a non-monetary society, work for individuals in their process of cultural and personal self-reflection. And there's, I indicated this a couple of times, but I want to flesh it out just a little bit because I think it's very remarkable. I think there's just an astonishing similarity to Marx's conception of the commodity fetishism or reification, which leads to the commodity fetishism. And Simmel does not know Marx's works on estrangement, so the Paris manuscripts and the excerpts on James Mill. They were published in the 1930s, so Simmel couldn't have known them. But the fetishism chapter in the first edition of Capital and the second edition of Capital, that Simmel will have known, and that just shows astonishing resemblances to Simmel's theory. And I think at one point in the Großstädter und das Geistesleben, Simmel makes explicit reference to Marx's theory of fetishism. And they have different, different perspectives on a similar problem, where Marx focuses on the way that productive relations do not become apparent to the producers anymore. Simmel focuses on a different problem area of cultural self-positioning, But apart from that, they draw very similar diagnoses. Marx says it is money that allows economic subjects to refer to an objective shape, a sachliche Gestalt, so the shape of an object, an external object, of their own productive relations. And the money form objectively veils the social character of private laborers and thus the social relations of private laborers. So where Marx thinks that the mediation of money not only changes productive relations, but hides the social sources that determine our productive relations. Simmel thinks about this in similar terms, just not regarding productive relations as such, but in a more broad sense, social relations that also encompass cultural self-understanding. And they draw two conclusions or two phenomena of this process of objectivation or of the objectivity. The one is that we've already talked about. There's an emptiness. Money as a destroyer of form results in the inability to relate to the meaning of commodities. And he talks about the heartlessness of money. It's always when I put quotation marks that it tells me that there must be an umlaut. Unforgiving objectivity and freedom without purpose. So it's pure potentiality, but we don't realize it in anything particular. And then also heteronomy, and he uses the same term that Marx uses when he talks about this process too, namely Naturförmigkeit. So relations that are mediated by money appear to follow laws similar to natural causality. That is, as soon as it is, and that seems to be fairly plausible, as soon as it is the market that determines what we produce, at what price, under which conditions, it doesn't appear anymore that it is society as a whole that determines what we want to do and what we want to do with our productive capacities, but it is an external force that actually regulates this. And sometimes, of course, we speak about this, that the market demands this or that, or that we don't want to disturb the market, and we depend on the market, and so forth. Okay, so two more slides, and then I'm done. So, if I'm not mistaken, then that's the general argument that Simmel wants to make about how money affects sort of our very conceptualization of ourselves and our social relations. And the mechanism that Simmel places at the heart of this diagnosis, and of course, the philosophy of money is about much more. So I'm just picking out sort of parts of an argument that are scattered around this book. There's also, of course, a lot on freedom and on measurement and so forth. But nevertheless, this argument, if that's in there, it nevertheless, I think, it must sort of answer to two objections that I'm not fully convinced that Simmel does this. The first obvious question is that, is it really true that all objects that are weighed in a monetary measure lose their distinctive qualitative determination that would allow us to reflect ourselves in them? So if we think about souvenirs, for example, the last time I was in Paris, when you go to Paris these days, you can't go past somebody selling these little Eiffel Towers, and they go like at 10 pieces for €5 or something like that. And when my son lost these Eiffel Towers at the playground about 3 months ago, this wasn't just a problem for him; it was a problem for my wife too. Because of course, we could get those Eiffel Towers. You probably wouldn't have to go to Paris; we could just order them on eBay. But they were the Eiffel Towers that we got at the Centre Pompidou. That spring. So it seems that that's just a silly example, but for many objects we can say, well, many objects we can value in monetary terms, but nevertheless, they retain a cultural meaning. Of course, you can buy a Rembrandt and still appreciate it for its quality as a part of the development of European art, or you can buy furniture, you can buy tools, you can relate to these objects. And it might be true that, for some objects, this is not going to work anymore. But that's the second objection. The question is whether is it really that all-encompassing that Simmel makes this claim. So Simmel says, that at some point he talks about the revenge of the commodities. It suits you right. You make everything so cheap and nondescript, and now everything breaks. Like the toaster or the frying pan that my parents seem to buy another one every year because they become cheaper and cheaper and nondescript. That's the revenge of the commodities. But does it really have this all-encompassing, culturally erosive effect? And I'm not sure about that. What I noticed when I was on the train to from the airport to Chicago, this epidemic of iWatches. Everyone on the car had the exact same watch. And you could say, well, that's nothing against these watches, but of course, they all look the same. That's not an object where you can say, well, this expresses me like a Philippe Patek or something like that, or I don't know, a Casio watch. It was something where people maybe in the past would have identified with a specific particular object and sort of seen something of themselves in the commodity. With a watch that looks the same, it tells something about you, but maybe not, something that it tells about everyone else at the same time. But the question is this really a problem? Don't we have sort of sufficient space for other objects? So we don't recognize ourselves in our watches anymore. Big deal, We recognize ourselves in the content of the social media accounts that are stored on the watches or that are accessed through the watches. So is it really true that? So first, is it really true that objects must necessarily lose their cultural quality by being measured for money? And I think in some aspects, Simmel has a point for forms of extreme commercialization, where it's, we just buy the stuff, throw it away. We don't have an occasion to think about the productive the vast expanse of productive cooperation that went together to produce these objects, and don't reflect on the exploitative relations that are entailed in the production of these objects at this price. So, but does it really affect all objects that are priced in money? And then the question is, does it really have this erosive effect on culture as a whole? Because couldn't there not, there could be enough objects left that we can reflect ourselves in. So we go more often to the flea market and, define ourselves less through the stuff that we buy at Walmart or through our furniture. But, it doesn't mean that, culture as a whole, society as a whole, becomes as anonymous as Simmel says. So despite these problems, I think there's a core idea in this that's at the heart of the general process. So even if you don't buy into the full argument, I think Simmel makes a crucial observation about what money is. That's very interesting because it entails a qualitative shift in our conceptual capacities. So we're able to grasp something that we weren't able to grasp before. And in a different paper that I've been working on for a long time, I call this a generic particular. I think in Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit, there's something similar that he refers to as a concrete universal. And what do I mean by this? Simmel puts it in these words. Simmel says that money is the tangibility of the most abstract, the individual entity. So you could say a concrete, in a philosophical terms, in a concrete object as opposed to an abstract object that has its significance above all in super individuality. So it's not a particular thing, or it is a particular thing, but it isn't just a token of a type. So what do I mean by this? I think what money does is it represents value as such. And so Simmel has the idea that the money that we have in our hands, it represents economic purchasing power or economic value or economic validity, but validity as such. So no specific form of value that we would recognize in the different objects that we value, but a concrete instantiation of the very quality that we find there. And you could say, what's so new about this? And I think that's again Marx, and it could be that Simmel has it from Marx too. Marx puts it in the first version of Capital. There's a passage and he takes this out in the second edition, where he says the introduction of money brings something that is conceptually very interesting, and his analogy is an analogy to the animal kingdom, and he says it is, when money enters the stage, or the universal equivalent at that point of the analysis, it is as if next to the tigers, the lion, the rabbits, and all the other members of the animal kingdom, the animal itself appears on the stage. And it's a concrete instantiation of an animal. So it would be like going into a museum of natural history. And so walking around and you're asking the guide, well, I'd like to see the insects. And he said, yeah, they're over there. And you would say, well, yeah, no, I could find bugs and bees and butterflies there, but I'm looking for a specimen of the insect, And he would scratch his head and, wouldn't know what we mean. And I think Simmel and Marx think that's exactly what's happening in the monetary economy. We find a concrete instantiation of value per se. We don't need this concrete instantiation for just valuing, right? For that, we could just use a measure or a scale. We wouldn't need concrete objects. But for exchanging, we need them. So you can measure something without having individual dollars, but having just the scale of the dollar, but you must exchange them. So in this, you find concrete instantiations of value per se, of the quality that is common to all other qualities. And I think this is sort of where you can make the most, or where you can find the most regarding the question what money does for philosophy. But here I'm also a little skeptical. So what Simmel does is he says this is a principle that we can find in other spheres than the economic sphere as well, right? So he says, that's a principle that you can find also in the natural sciences. We can talk about gravity as such, or force as such. We don't have to talk about individual horses and the power that they have for drawing something, but we can talk about horsepower as an abstract quality. We don't have to figure out, what is it that is pulling something and how much is it pulling. We can have an abstract notion of force as such and quantify it. So it seems like the idea of money as a concrete universal appears in other contexts as well. For example, in these where we talk about powers or forces. Simmel also has examples where we talk about cultural entities or social entities in the sense, where we think about the police or an officer as just a manifestation of the police. We don't worry about that particular officer, about that particular badge, but we know it's just an instantiation of a more general principle that's at work here. I'm just not sure whether we can say that money is just an epiphenomenon of a more general process that we see in the development of modern societies, or whether it's actually driving this. And I'm not sure whether it's within the powers of philosophy to determine whether the one or the other is true, because I wouldn't know if I have the means of determining it. But that's something where I think you can clearly make. So even if you don't buy into the whole argument of the erosive qualities of money, I think the conceptual novelty is something that's very convincing in Simmel, and it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be the causal mechanism that drives the other changes that we see. Most plausibly, I hear from other scholars that most plausibly in some aspects you can actually make this case, but nevertheless, it is a qualitative shift in our conceptual capacities, and that's, I think, where you can find sort of the most significant contribution to the question what Simmel does for the relation of money and philosophy. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to this. Yes.
That was great. Thank you. I'd like to maybe later on talk about that very last point about generics and stuff that Michael Thompson that I think is relevant to that. But I had a specific question more pertinent to our workshop here about categorizing Simmel alongside Mitchell-Innes and Knapp. And so in Mitchell-Innes it's explicit that thinking about money as a claim, the claim that the money holder has goes back to someone or something specific that the claim can be put on, right? So the government, right? And to discharge a tax debt, or Mitchell Innes describes how it can happen in small communities where the butcher has a claim on the baker, passes it to the brewer, whatever. When we get to the idea of having a claim on the entirety of society, it doesn't seem plausible that the entirety of society is capable of emitting the claims. And I take it that there's a shorthand for saying that in the market, generically, you can go to anybody and sort of with the legal tender function of money, you give them that money, they've got to give you the donuts or beer or whatever it is that you want to buy off of them. And that's the sense in which it's a claim on everybody. But if that's true, that makes me think that this still is, even if it's a different story about the nature of money than the Adam Smith medium of exchange emerging out of barter story, the function of money is still located primarily in the market. And what's really striking to me about a Mitchell Innes or a Knapp story is that the function of money might, or the value of money might ultimately derive from its tax clearing function, and then markets can spring up secondarily. So does Simmel have, if he's going to stick with this claim that, like, all right, here's the ontology of money, it is a claim on everybody in society, what's his claim of the genesis of that power?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think you're exactly right. So conceptualizing money as a claim upon society is probably at best a shortcut, because everyone could say it's not a claim upon me. I'll accept it because I can use it, but I don't owe you anything. The baker doesn't owe me anything because I have money. I can pay with it. But if it's in my checking or banking account, the bank owes me something. If I have a $50 bill, I guess the U.S. Treasury owes me something, namely $50.
It used to be gold when he was written. It would have been exchangeable for actual precious metal, right?
Yeah. But here's where I agree. So it would have to be translated it would have to be translated to the government owes me something, namely that it will be accepted for the redemption of taxes, for example, and then it's a Knappian story or a chocolate story. Now, I think Simmel could make a wider point and say the central point is that it's not market because there's still it owes me something. So it's a deontic phenomenon. It's a phenomenon of obligation. And so the question is, okay, I can see why the government has an obligation towards me because they issued the money. But couldn't you argue that society as a whole is determined by the use of money in a society is determined by a sense of I think that's actually Mitchell Innes puts this in exactly this word, that money is derived from a sense of obligation, namely the law of debt. Now, in one sense, you can sort of trace this back to the obligation that the government has towards me if it issued this money. But you could think about sort of more loosely arranged monetary systems where this nevertheless wouldn't be a market society. So think of money, the money that's always referred to in popular descriptions. The yacht money that's defined by Furness or described by Furness, adequately or not. There, you don't exchange the stones, but you have a sense of the obligation, and it's not an obligation, that stems from some clansman who, is sort of owes something for all of those stones, but everyone sort of feels a sense of obligation to abide by this mechanism of accounting. So in this sense, I think you could say it's still a different story than the pure market society, because you have money as the credit theory of money doesn't just mean it's a state theory of money, but it's a deontic theory of money. So it's primarily about how we understand obligations that are associated with money. But I would agree that in contemporary or in capitalist societies at Simmel's times, the obligation of the government would play a central part. In that sense, can't say that society as a whole has an obligation unless you say we all decided that we're good for government money. And then you have sort of an implicit social obligation, but probably the more accurate story is that it's an indirect obligation namely that it's an obligation by the government. And
okay, thank you.
Yeah. And the story that gets told about the development of that, which I think has some validity anyway, is that the use of money in the market is enforced by the government collecting taxes. So everybody owes the government, so that whether they want to or not, right, everybody has to go out into the market in order to get money. So that's how the possessor of money, everybody else has an obligation that can be met by that, because otherwise the government will beat them up.
Yeah, but I think that, isn't it, so is this an adequate description of why we accept money? Now, I think we could make the claim that we have sort of internalized, an internalized set of norms that, that's just what we do, we accept it. I don't think about, when I bought my friend a pizza and probably wouldn't ask for money then. When somebody gives me money, wants to return money for some reason, I don't accept it because I think, I could pay my taxes with that. So many people think about it, well, of course, at some point, you can say that it can only come into place if some form of an enforcement mechanism is established. And in many, if you look at, colonial history and all this, that's also it's also a mechanism how you can get people to work who would want to stay in subsistence farming because now they have to pay taxes. Yeah. So I agree that sort of at a story of the origin of money, I'm no expert on this, and I'm not trained to judge on this, but it sounds plausible to me.
But then clearly it becomes internalized and becomes I've certainly seen it as an account, for example, of how the European economy gets monetized in the 11th, 12th century.
I mean, there's a theory about the origins of coinage which goes like this. It starts because the Lydian kings have a lord gold which they used to pay mercenaries. But of course, the mercenaries helped them to win even more gold. And so the standardization of the coin is designed to pay the same amount to very large numbers of soldiers, right? But that's not enough, because in any military campaign, there are massive problems of logistics. How do you feed these people?
Yeah.
Well, what you do is that you announce to your population they've got to pay their taxes in these coins. Yeah. So they rush to feed the army with all the food they're producing. The coins then go into the hands of the peasants and then back to the monarch. Beautiful system. Yeah. And that's actually quite a plausible kind of how mass coinage gets going.
Two more, I think you were first.
So I was thinking about Hegel and his views in connection with Simmel, because Hegel's a lot more optimistic about our ability to find ourselves as agents, actualize our agency in modernity, basically. And it seems to me like he pursues two strategies, one of which you mentioned already, which is to point out that there are plenty of non-monetary relations that we find ourselves in under modern conditions, especially to each other. So if you look at Hegelian Sittlichkeit, you've got family relationships and civic bonds and things like that they're just not money relations, right? Yeah. And so does Simmel, in his kind of pessimism about modernity, right, is he sort of downplaying the extent to which everything is monetized? And then the second question is whether even monetized relations, I was thinking about Hegel's account contract, right? And Hegel is much more optimistic in a way because he thinks that contract is a genuine form of recognition, right? So it's like a form of sort of it's hard to exactly cash it out, but when we agree to a contract, you recognize me as having needs, I recognize you as having needs. We have a kind of like-mindedness mediated by money, right? But it's not a completely alienated relationship. It's a real recognition relationship. And so does Simmel, does he have answers to those kinds of responses to his more, I take it the general texture of his view is much more pessimistic about our ability to achieve this kind of self-actualization.
Yeah, he's so in the beginning of his argument, he says, of course, a lot of benefits come with it. So my narrative was a little more pessimistic than Simmel's narrative, because Simmel says, it brings us this enormous form of freedom, and then the problem is, we really want this freedom, we don't want to work on our feudal landlords, we want to be able to pay it off and move on with our lives. And Simmel says, the tragedy of it is that the freedom that we get is unfortunately an empty freedom. And so I think the strategies that you're talking about, I think Simmel even recognizes that we don't have to keep money out of all these spheres where it could have this corrosive effect. He gives this example of a concert where the conductor, I think he says it's the conductor, maybe it's the piano, whoever plays the concert, they don't just want the money, but they want the applause. So we clearly have institutions in place, or formalities in place that allow us to exchange forms of recognitions next to the monetary recognition, and we do that all the time, right? When I go to the coffee shop, I have, I pay for my coffee. I want a coffee. Done deal. We don't have to enter a relation of reciprocity and sort of kinship or whatever. It's done, but nevertheless, we show forms of recognition that are completely acceptable. I think Simmel is worried about sort of the extent that it's going to be taking, with the anonymization in societies that become larger and larger, or people that here when I'm in the US, I always feel like in some parts of this country, people just don't see one another anymore. They go they're at home, they get in their car, they go somewhere, they buy their stuff, they go in their car, go to their friends that they know, and then they get in their car, go somewhere else. So it seems like Simmel would have been happy with this because on the one hand, because he didn't seem to be a person who liked these anonymous contacts and all the the mass of people flowing around. But then again, so the problem is the sort of the general expansionary tendencies of this. So in many contexts we have these institutions and places that sort of help us to work money into the transactions, and nevertheless the transaction remains a human interaction. And then just one more sense, I think you're mentioning Hegel. I think that's for both Simmel and Marx, this could be a workaround to sort of not describe this this process as so devastating, because we can we can consider interacting in marketplaces if we do this with the knowledge that the market makes sure that it provides for everyone. So this the Axel Honneth's reading of Hegel, if we all know that we live in the market that provides for everyone, no one's left behind, we don't see people lying in the streets and being kicked out of the market and without shoes and so forth. So if we know that this is sort of a rational institution that follows sort of minimal norms of recognition and moral understanding, then it's okay that we're treating one another as anonymous subjects, because we know that everyone is basically taken care of. So we might lose sort of the very demanding Simmelian and Marxian idea, whether it's a specific form of cooperation producing for the other, or seeing oneself in the object that they produce, and sort of relate this maybe to more specific processes and just let the market be the market, as long as it's not devoid of all humanness.
Just one little note. Just to clarify, of course, Simmel's not giving an account of the origin of money.
Oh no, yeah,
that's important. So those debates. But one thing, I think one way you can read, just to contribute to your discussion about money as a claim upon society, the exchange is guaranteed rather accepted, that Simmel's claim is that in a modern society that reduces hierarchical relations, because we don't have aristocracy, etc., then money becomes the primary institution of trust. Mm-hmm. And that money is fundamentally an institution of trust, precisely because when I give you $5, that's a relationship of trust, that the product works as it should, that the money is worth $5 when you accept it, et cetera. So I think one way to read this is that the sociological foundation for, let's call it a more economic conception of debt and credit is trust. And that one of the primary institutions of trust, in God we trust, right, is money. And so that's how I read the language of claim guarantee. It's a way to start talking about a sociology of trust that occurs as a precondition for a functioning monetary economy in the way that then you described well.
Okay, yeah. So you don't, so just to clarify this, so would you say that, so what came to my head was, when I have I have money in my pocket, and sort of in the description that I think Simmel would give, sort of I have a condensed form of power in my pocket, and I can trust in its working,
Exactly.
And so I know, so I feel much. So I just cashed my reimbursement, my travel reimbursement check, and I probably shouldn't tell you, but there's actually a lot of money in my bag right now, and so. This gives me sort of confidence, I can rely on everyone here. I can rely on the people in the gas station because I have this social power in my pocket. They're not going to be my friends. They wouldn't do this for me if I didn't have the money. But I can trust in the social network that society provides based on sort of this specific instance of power that I have. Deranged as this form may be. Yeah, but that's
and then that's going to be the sociological basis for recognition and participation in aliens. So the argument is you need to have the structure of trust for there to even be recognition that's functioning, for there to have Sittlichkeit. So that's how it's positioned vis-a-vis Hegel.
But in this description, what I always find problematic about this, it's just a very sad form of trust, right? Because I know that, if I lose this money, or if I just have the credit card, I can have the same trust. But if it doesn't work, which happened to me a couple of times when I was abroad here, all the trusting, all the trusting isn't sort of reciprocated by the others. It fades.
It's not the only form of trust, but it's one of the predominant. There's others, obviously, family. But it's one of the predominant ones in a society that doesn't have hierarchy of loyalty. So
I agree.
An argument of egalitarian societies need a maximum degree of trust because you don't have loyalty obligations. And that's roughly the argument.
All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you so much.